feel like with practicing, there's so many things that we can do that we can, as long as we dedicate ourselves to our musicianship, that's not necessarily like, I am practicing this with a metronome slow tempo. It's like, oh, well, I'm fortunate to play a lot of gigs, and, I'm not practicing for the people that I'm playing with, but I can count that as dedicating myself to my musicianship.
I am such a fan of today's guest and what he's up to. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and we are chatting today with Danny Ziemann, who's been on the podcast several times before. Love Danny and what he does. And he's actually just come out with a new book called Topics in Jazz Bass Volume 1, Harmony. Now, this is not the first book for Danny. He did the series The Lowdown, Volumes 1 and 2. Those came out in 2016 and 2017, I believe. And we talked about that on the podcast a couple years ago. Danny's also done some courses with Discover Double Bass. Very cool. I had him on the podcast along with Jeff Chalmers about that, so I know you'll enjoy that. Before we dive in, a quick shout out to our sponsors, Colstein Music, A440, the Bass Violin Shop, D'Addario Strings, Upton Bass, and Steve Swan String Bass. Thanks for keeping the lights on here, folks. And let's get into this conversation with Danny Ziemann. I was thinking back, and we talked first in 2016, the Lowdown Volume 1, right? Okay, so Since then, let me see. So Lowdown Volume 1, Volume 2. Then you've also done Discover Double Bass 2 courses, right? The Bass Player's Guide to the Trio and Walk On, right? Yep. Okay, so, and now, new book, and it's a big, chunky, amazing book, too. So Topics in Jazz Bass Volume 1, so more to come.
Yeah.
The Lowdown, I have recommended that every time I do a clinic, I have a recommended resources page, and I recommend that book all the time. It's written with clarity through the eyes of an educator, and it's been really fun going through it and reading the latest book, Topics in Jazz Bass. So maybe can you just talk about the idea behind this book and the series, and just what inspired you to put out this new volume?
Yeah, absolutely. So the impetus for it was I wanted to be able to write whatever I'm interested in, and I didn't want it to have to be sequential. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing that I felt like with the Lowdown 1 and 2, they serve their purposes for explaining sort of walking bass, sort of the most fundamental point. And I realized if I wanted to continue writing, it didn't make sense to have the Lowdown Volume 3, because then it would put me in a box. Mm-hmm. So the way I envision Topics in Jazz Bass is it's more of like a web. And one of the series of books that really inspired me, one of my professors tipped me off to it. I think it's by a pedagogue named Simon Fischer. Yeah. And I should actually look this up as I'm speaking with you. Simon Fischer. So he's got a series of books, and there's one called Sound and one called Practice, and it's based off of the columns that he wrote, I think, for Strad magazine. But basically, it's just whatever he's interested at the time, he can compile a source of information and put that out. And I wanted that because most of what I write is a reflection of what I'm practicing or what I'm really seeing from other people or what I'm reading in the research. So that was sort of the birth of the series. And then Topics in Jazz Bass Harmony was really inspired by the harmonic ideas that I was digging at the time, based on what I've read and watched with Barry Harris, and my own pursuit of, being, I'm kind of a closeted piano player right now. So it's my pursuit to get past that, and all those things were just kind of informing what I was doing in my bass playing. So that's sort of the genesis of it, at least.
Cool. I that Simon Fischer, that series is amazing. I was actually just listening to Nathan Cole, LA Philharmonic, I believe associate concertmaster, second chair, whatever. He has a podcast himself, and he was talking, I think this was 2 days ago, I was listening to this, about Simon Fischer and about some warm-ups. if I'm not mistaken. Now, I have that Simon Fischer practice book, and it's amazing. It's such a deep dive, and you're right. This reminds me, this is in the spirit of that. So those are incredible resources. If people haven't checked those out, those Simon Fischer books are really awesome. And it's been fun going through this. My copy, I've got a digital copy here on my iPad that is just covered in notes. So far too many things than we can cover. But all good. Just like I want to hear more. But I would love to. You said that this came about as a result of like what you're practicing on a daily basis, and I'm just curious because you're obviously a guy that gets a lot of things done. You move through a lot of really interesting projects, and you're traveling. Like, what does daily practice look like for you? Like, can you take me through? Could be a week at home, or maybe a week on the road, or maybe both. Like, what does your practicing typically look like?
Okay, so the truth comes out. I'm not as diligent of a practicer as I would like to be.
Well, neither am I. So I think we're all in that club.
Yeah. So I think a lot of it is dependent on what's going on at the time. So let's say the past 5 months, for a big chunk of time, that's when I was the interim jazz bass professor at Eastman, and I found myself playing daily in lessons with students. So I would play for about 4 hours a day in just situations like in duo situations. So for me, after about 4 hours of practice, I find myself, or 4 hours of just playing, I'm pretty fried if there's gigs on top of that too. So in that situation, a lot of my playing was a lot of it was actually based around what I did in the book. Mm-hmm. But it would be a lot of fingerboard exercises. So really functional harmonic fingerboard exercises, like taking a major scale, and instead of, I'm going to go a little theory intensive. Great. But so let's say we have the C major scale. Instead of taking the diatonic chords that are associated with each note in a major scale, so like C major, D minor, E minor, and so on, just kind of like if you were to take like a C major triad on the piano and just keep the same position and move all the way up through the notes. Instead of doing that, finding different chords that we can attach to each note in a major scale to harmonize it differently. Or like what Bach says is the rule of the octave, finding new ways to do that. So things that are familiar, but then finding unfamiliar ways to reorganize that information, or just to reassociate what we know. So things like that. And I found even if I try and take something incredibly simple, just using chord tones or just two notes, it's still, I can find lots and lots of ways to trip myself up and find new ways to navigate through jazz tunes with some of those exercises. So I'm not dodging the question of my daily practice, but a lot of it, again, is just informed by what I'm doing with the students. So it might be like we play, like there are a couple of days where I made everyone play like a jazz blues for an hour, and I would just yell out key changes and we would switch. So it might be things like that where it's endurance or mental exercises, like things like that. Not so much playing the scales and arpeggios as much as I would like to, as much as I encourage other people to do. And then I try to practice some Bach with a bow. That's really? Like a standard that I try to maintain. Yeah. Not enough to play for other people. Not at that point, but just for my own, just to keep that phrasing and musicality in my ear.
That's a daily practice for you. You try to make that a daily practice. That's fascinating. That's something and being a classical player primarily, like I have been remarkably bad at incorporating Bach on a daily basis, but I'm that's one of my, I wouldn't say a 2019 resolution, but it's something I'm going to start doing. I've got Young Ho Fu's transcription of the Bach cello suite, which are down a fourth largely. And they're just a little, I usually play them up the octave, but that's my next thing to add into my practice rotation. So, I think it's interesting talking about that, because we have different phases in our life in terms of practice and in terms of what we're doing, what we do at 18, 20, 22, when our job is practicing and when we're a music student, versus when we're teaching many hours a day. I mean, that it's all one and the same, right? We're reading, we're teaching, we're getting inspired. So like what I do if I have like a week off on the bass is radically different than if I'm teaching 25 hours a week,
Yeah, exactly. And it's about setting your expectations for yourself. And then I think there's also, without diving down the philosophical deep end, I think there are certain conceptions about what practicing actually means. And it's easiest to quantify practice in terms of hands on the instrument, like going to the gym or something. Like, oh, I spent 3 hours at the gym today, so I'm 3 hours more in shape than I was yesterday. And I feel like with practicing, there's so many things that we can do that we can, as long as we dedicate ourselves to our musicianship, that's not necessarily like, I am practicing this with a metronome, slow tempo.
Yeah.
And there are some pedagogues, like I know, like I was talking to a drummer friend about this, and he read somewhere that there's one school of thought that says play music 80% of the time and practice 20% of the time. And the ratio, I mean, obviously differs for different people, but I was inspired by that because it's like, oh, well, I'm fortunate to play a lot of gigs, and, I'm not practicing for the people that I'm playing with, but I can count that as dedicating myself to my musicianship, and then using the 20% of the time just to tweak things that I'm noticing in my playing.
That's a great way to look at it. Kind of like a more zoomed out, dedicating myself to my musicianship. And I find myself, even as I'm walking around San Francisco here, thinking through things. I woke up in the middle of the night and I couldn't sleep last night. And I was actually, and I rarely do this, but I was actually going through and figuring out what closed notes could be played with harmonics, and what those harmonies what those two notes would imply harmonically, which maybe, other people listening or you certainly have done that. But like, I was going through all string combinations, and then I was like, somehow I drifted off. But hey, maybe that was musicianship, kind of.
It's a new counting sheet, right?
Yeah, I know. Well, so one of the things you explore early on in this book is this adapting 1-5-1 harmony to notes and you explain it very clearly, but it's a really cool concept. And can you just talk about that concept a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So in Western music, or like Western theory, the relationship between tonic and dominant is the most fundamental harmonic relationship that we have. I mean, there's jokes that you can distill down a Beethoven symphony to 1-5-1 and that's it. So going off of that idea, I realized like how fundamental that is to bass players, because we are in the big picture always outlining those harmonies in whether it is Beethoven or a jazz tune or a Beatles song or something. So taking that idea, I wanted to try and find ways to add more functionality to my bass lines. And that's where this idea of 1-5-1 relationships sort of took off. So zooming out into the big picture, when you have a tonic and dominant relationship, you either have a dominant chord moving to a major chord, generally speaking, or a dominant chord moving to a minor chord. Now, let's say that I'm playing over, like I have a C major chord that I'm walking a bass line on. What I wanted to understand is, if I'm playing a C major 7 and I play the note D, what does D mean? Like, what notes does it imply in the context of C major, but also just on its own? Like, what's happening? Is that supporting the harmony, or is that disrupting the harmony? So the easiest way that you can break it down is to say that C major, like if you have the notes C, E, and G, those belong to a major triad. And if you have the notes D, F, and B, those belong to a dominant sound. So then the idea is, if I play C, D, E, F, and G, that's referencing C is tonic, D is dominant, E is tonic, F is dominant, and G is tonic. And what that does for me is that now starts to allow me to understand the functionality of most of the notes that I'm playing in my walking bass line, as if a piano player or a guitarist or someone who's comping would understand. And that allows me ultimately, like sort of zooming through, the next 100 or so pages, you can apply that for minor, and then it really just gives you an understanding of how all of your note choices are affecting functional harmony and how they relate to what's going on around you.
This episode is brought to you by D'Addario Strings. Our friends at D'Addario want to help listeners change their strings safely and efficiently, and they have a few tricks to help you achieve that. Did you know that you can tell the difference between D'Addario strings by the silking? Peg and silking denotes pitch and tension. So E is green, A is black, D is yellow, and G is red. C, by the way, is purple if you have a C string. A thin band of yellow just before the metal winding denotes light tension, and a thin orange band of silking denotes heavy tension. Ball end silking, that's the stuff down by the tailpiece, denotes string family like Kaplan, Helicore, or Zyx. Learn more at orchestral.d'addario.com, and thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. This episode is brought to you by Steve Swan String Bass. And Steve travels far and wide here in the Western United States. Here's Steve on where he goes and what some of the benefits of being able to travel like that are.
You travel with it. You're going up to Oregon. You're going up to Seattle.
Up to Seattle,
yeah.
And back, out to Arizona, wherever people want to see a selection, they don't have options, or if I have a line on some basses I want to check out and maybe buy or trade, I have the option. That's the beauty of me not being tied to a workbench in a shop.
Steve works with some of the San Francisco Bay Area's best professional bass luthiers, people like Nathaniel Rich, Alex Friedman, and many others, to get basses playing beautifully. When someone comes to me asking where to look for a bass, whether they're a student or professional, or they're coming through town and they want to try out a great selection of basses, I always send them to Steve. Learn more at steveswanstringbass.com, and thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast, Steve. What is an American style of bass? Here's Gary and Eric from Upton Bass on the topic.
So there's a joke about American instruments, all right? If I can take 4 violins and go to, let's say, a top-notch violin appraiser, and he can take the first one out and look at it and go, well, this one's clearly Italian because of all these features. Next one, oh, this is French because of all these features. Next one, no, this is English because of these features. 4th violin, they can't tell what it is, and then they go, it's American. It's got a little bit of everything.
Learn more about their Bostonian, American-style model, and so many other things that they have to offer you at uptonbass.com. And thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. Yeah, you talk about the way that pianists or guitarists think of harmony and how different that can be from many bass players, right? Because they live in that world of harmony and interval construction. I mean, that's just their life, and how we can sometimes almost get away, maybe as a term, with not having that depth of knowledge, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that wasn't supposed to be a dig against bass players, but I think it's just the nature of our instrument is that we generally, in a straight ahead jazz context, will play one note at a time. And even if we stick with the basic information, we're not responsible for voice leading 5 notes at a time, or 6 notes, or 7 notes like some piano players. And that becomes their life's study, is voice leading. I mean, just the fact that, almost every piano player I know, if they say you want to learn how to play the piano, you have to study all of Bach's chorales. And I feel like there's some equivalencies on the bass in terms of things that we can practice for voice leading, like Hanon. But for the most part, a lot of our etudes, especially in sort of classic repertoire, like the Simandl books, are dealing with one note at a time.
Yeah.
So I think are compound melodies, so to speak. So I've always had piano envy, and I've wanted to say, well, like what are they doing? Like, how can they handle that many responsibilities at once? And why am I not expected to know that? Because I feel like that would be very valuable for me, just to be able to understand how to get in the way and support that, or just build empathy for the people I'm playing with.
And kind of piggybacking on that, and you mentioned that you're sort of exploring the piano more and more. There was a class at Northwestern University, jazz piano for the non-pianist, or something titled like that, by former Northwestern faculty member Mike Coker, who now I think heads up the jazz department at Arizona State, if I remember right. Yeah. Fabulous guy. The class would fill up the moment that registration opened. I never got in, but I heard such great things about it. And then I also think about like the Evolving Bassist, Rufus Reed's book, and the piano voicings. Like, when did you always play a little piano, or when did you start exploring the piano more and more? And how do you think it's informing your musicianship?
Yeah, so I took some lessons in high school, like very brief lessons. And then, I had to take class piano in college. And I say had to, not get to, because I'll be careful with how I say this. But the things that I was interested in, as I'm sure with many college students, was not what I was learning. So I seriously started to practice probably when I was like 22 or 23. My roommates had a piano in our apartment, and I used to just play every day. And the way I started was by trying to figure out Christmas songs, like jazz versions of Christmas songs. Nice. So for about 6 months out of the year, it was Christmas in our apartment. And that was interesting for me because I never really practiced reading so much. Like if you put a piece of music in front of me, I'll just walk out the door. But if you ask me to play Satin Doll or Autumn Leaves or something, like I have no problem doing that. And so that for me was just, I wanted to play tunes. I wanted to sound as much like a jazz piano player as quickly as possible. So figuring out tunes, figuring out voicings, and then I found that a lot of my bass students were, they were trying to learn how to walk bass lines, and it was actually quite difficult for them to understand their function as a walking bass player when the way that I was accompanying them was with the bass. Mm-hmm. So it's easier for them to relate to the music when I played piano and played voicing. So that expedited my practice just to learn how to sound as idiomatic as possible. And it really helped just seeing how all of the notes move and how everything voice leads through chords and how different textures affect what I play. Mm-hmm. And also how hearing what my bass students are playing, how do I say this? Better understanding what I notice from bass players when I'm not playing the bass. Like if I'm playing the piano and I'm hearing that, it's like, whoa, like that's what people are reacting to. Like I'm a bass player and I'm not even noticing some of the stuff that's coming at me.
Yeah, that's so valuable. That perspective shift, right? Getting on another instrument. And I mean, I do that in a classical context. I'm a very, very poor pianist. But just like I use the piano all the time when I'm teaching, or especially used to in Chicago, back when I had more pianos sitting around. Do you have any, how did you start to explore hip voicings, voicings in a jazz context? Were there any resources, like any books, or were you just listening, or like what advice might you have for somebody out there who wants to start figuring out piano voicings? Are there any go-to resources out there?
Yeah, there's Mark Levine has a jazz piano book, which I referenced and I really enjoyed. Honestly, two things. So I found some sheets that just had very simple 2-5-1 voicings. So doing the root and then third and seventh, and then adding third, seventh, and ninth, and sort of filling it out slowly. So I practiced those in 12 keys. And then I'm fortunate to have really patient friends who are phenomenal jazz piano players. So every few months I would just ask them for about an hour of their time and say, okay, I feel like this is a sound that I recognize in the music, and I would try to, hack it out, and then say, what can you tell me about this? And they would give me some guidance, and it would give me enough fuel for a few months at a time. And the last thing that really helped, I did have a few months of jazz piano lessons, which were more in the vein of composition lessons with a jazz pianist. And he said, if you want to learn how to play the piano, write your own music. And I found that to be very, very helpful. So I tried to write a lot of tunes, and that helped me recognize. It gave me an opportunity to figure out what I was hearing in a way that really motivated me. Because if I have to just check things off a list, like I am the last person to be motivated by to-do lists and those types of practice requirements.
I hear you so much about class piano not being what you want to get out of piano. I remember so clearly my DePaul University was doing this music education degree, and it was spring quarter in Chicago. Beautiful leaves are on the trees. And so this was 2 p.m. on like a Thursday, and it was like a 2-hour just hack fest. It was one of those, it was, I think, sight reading for the non-pianist or something, And so it was a stack of, I kid you not, like 10 to 11 things that, though it was a sight reading course, they were also giving you a ton of stuff to just try to practice and reduce down. And, I'm not a skipper, but I've never been more inclined to want to skip a class. He's like walking out, it's beautiful, finally in Chicago. And then, I got to go into this lab and just like hack away at this stuff. But I never, you think about what you end up doing later in life, thinking about that comprehensive musicianship like you were talking about. For a period of years, the bulk of I spent more time at the piano and conducting than I did playing bass. Most of my money was coming from those. I never in a million years thought I would have been doing that. So you never know where those skills may take you or what the portions might be as you go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely.
So again, I have way too many things in this book to talk about than we have time for. I know, but okay, something early on is you talk about the hip sounding bass lines, like the hip fact and the dangers of that. Can you talk about that concept and some of the pitfalls with trying to be hip, or what that even means?
Yeah, exactly. And this is a reflection of my own musicianship. But I think with my pursuit of being a bass player, I was always interested in trying to do things that sounded cool. And for me, that was playing lines that were chromatic and playing lines that were rhythmically active. And the lines that were chromatic, I don't know, I found that a lot of the notes that I was playing eventually, like, again, didn't really relate to what was going on, but it sounded cool. So I think the hip factor, the danger of that is perceiving something as sounding cool, but not actually understanding how it functions. Mm-hmm. And I think because doing something so simple and so fundamentally rooted, like playing arpeggios or simple chord tones or like reducing passing tones, feels so elementary on paper.
Yeah.
You know, it's like step one, play chord tones. But for me, it's actually been the most difficult thing to do and make sound good. And that is because it requires a really strong understanding of how the most basic harmony moves, which I feel like is not associated with being cool. So again, the danger is we play things that we don't understand, and we play things, by we, I mean, like, again, me in my earlier pursuit, played things that I didn't understand in terms of how it relates to the music, and also the potential to totally just blow up what other people are doing. Mm-hmm. Like if I play a B natural on an F minor chord, when the piano player is playing a really beautiful, lush voicing, because it's just something that's in my fingers, or I think it sounds cool to play passing tones. And that to me is disruptive. It's not the most effective choice I can play. So again, thinking about what is foundational and thinking about just, again, the fundament of what we're doing, I think it can reduce a lot of those choices that might be superfluous or sound cool on the surface, but not actually add much value.
Yeah, that's great. That comes up again and again throughout the book, and something. And obviously, this is a major part of this book. But like I've thought in my limited jazz experience, you know, when you're playing a song with slower moving chord changes, and it's just like E major 7 for like 4 bars, right? Like, what do I do? And that's you explore this so wonderfully in this book, like applying 2-5 or applying, well, I guess 2-5-1 and then 1-5-1 harmony to these chunks, these 2-bar chunks, and then beyond that. Can you talk about that? I hope I'm being clear.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will say that the setup of this book, and I didn't make this very clear, but the idea is that chapter 1 is sort of necessary for everyone to read, but then you can explore the chapters out of order. So it's not a linear book. Mm-hmm. And what it does is it reinforces the concept, like you were saying, of 1-5-1 and all these different contexts. Mm-hmm. So one of the contexts is if I have let's say 4-bar passage, or let's say 4 bars of, like you said, E major 7, like, how do I play that without just playing a major scale? Or how do I walk over that without playing chromaticism? And that chapter talks about the fact that you can imply the dominant chord of E major, which is B7, in your walking lines. Like, you can actually play a measure of E major 7 and a measure of B7, and then go back to E major 7 again, where you have that tonic, dominant, tonic resolution within the chord, and it won't disrupt anything. And that's the same thing that piano players do if they're comping over E major 7. They're going to detail the fact that they're in the key of E by playing either a dominant sound or some other chords that really just reinforce the fact that we're in the key of E. So I was like, well, I want to do that on the bass. And I want to incorporate that in my lines. So that was one of the contexts for that. And you would actually use the full E major triad and a 3-note reduction of B7. And then you can do that also over measures, like 2 measure segments of the same chord. So you can do 2 notes of E major, 2 notes of B7, and then 2 notes of E major. It's all about completing the resolution. So that's a way to get more functional harmony in the lines. For example, I think that's chapter 2 and I can't remember. At least chapter 1 and 2.
Well, I just realized like what a lame-o classical player I am. I like used E major as an example. In fact, and that takes me back to like 20 years or more years ago at Northwestern in my jazz combo. We did an exercise. We all played over an E major blues, and we're like trying to whip out, like the saxophone players, and it's like nobody was pulling out their hippest material. So my true colors are showing through, but
no, it's great. It's great. I mean, that's the thing. Like we should be comfortable in those keys. There was a recording I heard of the Brett Meldau trio playing a B blues, and same with Pat Metheny. And I mean, they just absolutely crush it.
Mm-hmm.
There's no understanding or no anything about that key being difficult to them.
One of the great bass players of all time, Fred Zimmerman, former principal bass at the New York Philharmonic. He was Barry Colstein of Colstein Music. He was Barry's bass teacher. Here's Barry on Fred Zimmerman.
Anybody that knew Fred would say he was one of a kind. I mean, the man was probably the most talented, the most giving. He was the most interesting. Not only was he an amazing teacher, an amazing performer, he was an amazing artist also. He was truly a great artist.
Along with Fred Zimmerman, people like Milt Hinton, Homer Mensch, Orrin O'Brien, and so many others have had their basses worked on at Colstein's or had instruments made for them by Colstein's. Thank you, Barry, for everything that you've done for the bass world. And folks, check them out at colstein.com. And thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. This episode is brought to you by the Bass Violin Shop, which opened in 2001 as a small double bass workshop in Greensboro, North Carolina. Today, they're staffed by 3 full-time, highly skilled bass luthiers, and they specialize in double bass sales, rentals, setup, restoration, and repair. For nearly 20 years, they have satisfied thousands of clients by offering quality instruments, knowledgeable service, reliable repairs, and superior restorations at affordable prices. They offer high-quality, custom ebony C extensions with 2 different chromatic latch options. Handmade ebony latches with adjustable aluminum mounts by New Harmony Music, or adjustable brass latches by Rob Anzelotti. Give the Bass Violin Shop a call to discuss your extension needs. For more information and current inventory, visit their website at bassviolinshop.com and be sure to follow them on Facebook and Instagram. I want to talk to you. I love digging into these these geeky little minutia, but okay, talk to me about sixths. You have a great line. I have it highlighted. You say the sixth is not only an incredibly powerful interval on the bass, but plays a significant role in Western harmony. The simplest and most effective way to harmonize the sound is with sixths and then with thirds. So can you expand on that? I hear you loud and clear, and but just talk about that interval, the sixth and maybe the third too.
Yeah. So the sixth on the bass is it's one of my favorites because I think it resonates so well. When you play a sixth, you have to skip a string in order to be able to do it, unless you're using an open string. Mm-hmm. But for example, like F to D on if I have my thumb on the neck block and I'm playing F with my second finger on the A string and D with my first finger on the G string, mm-hmm. That distance where you skip a string creates this really beautiful resonance on the instrument. So I think anything above a fifth forces you to skip a string, and that really opens up a lot of powerful it just opens up a lot of possibilities on the instrument. So from a sonic perspective, it really is beautiful. From a theoretical perspective, you can go back to, I'm sure even earlier than Bach, but I think about a classic example of when he harmonizes the inventions the inventions and stuff from the Well-Tempered Clavier. I think there's the C minor. It's either the C minor invention or the C minor prelude. I just took a music history class and my teacher would just kill me if they heard me sing this. But the counter line to the melody is in sixths and then thirds. And again, just the simplest way to harmonize something is by using a sixth or a third. And if you want a tight voicing, use a third. And if you want a more open sound, use a sixth. And there's, if you listen to Brahms, a lot of the cadences can be where the low note is a third and then the root note's on top. So I think it's just kind of like peppered through. I'm not going to give more examples, but it's just kind of present in Western harmony that the third is the first place that you go if you want to harmonize things. And then as harmony evolved, it became fourths and then sevenths, and then you can harmonize with seconds and so on. So that's the sort of foundation for the idea. It sounds nice on the bass. It's one of the most fundamental harmonies in our system of harmony. And then if you look for one thing I'm interested in, and I give to a lot of my students, is just trying to find all the intervallic possibilities within any given chord. So like a C major chord, like what notes or what intervals can you come up with if you look at every note to every note? And there's always the third or the sixth always uses, at least in a major chord, the fifth and the third, which creates like the fifth up to the third, which creates a sixth, or the root down to the third, which creates a sixth, either a minor or a major sixth. And to me, it's just, that's something that's really easy on the hand, like really intuitive on the bass. So in terms of finding functional harmony and things that are really quick to grab, where you don't really have to think so much about it, the sixth is just really intuitive. It's in our hand, and it travels well around the bass. You don't have to accommodate big changes through the strings. It's sort of like, for me, the magic interval, if such a thing exists.
It's a tasty interval, and it does sit so well on the bass. And yeah, there's something about you're totally on the money. There's something about skipping that string that opens up. I remember watching Rufus Reed do tenths, go E string to G string, and just that sound and it really does. It brings out these two voices, and yeah, like you said, opens up the resonance of the instrument in a really interesting way.
And I like what you said about the two voices, because that's right on the money. Like, the thing about it is, because you skip the string, it allows me at least to conceptualize two independently moving lines. And that's what happens when we play an interval that's, a third, you can move thirds and you have two lines that are moving. But when you skip a string, it physically creates a space where you can start to identify it in a different way. And that's one of the things that I wanted to get to in this book, is just showing that when we're playing bass lines, it's not just one line at a time, but we actually are voice leading multiple lines at once. And when you use these intervals, you actually can physically feel it, and you can see it and identify it and hear it, because it puts everything in a different range.
It's a heck of a book. Like the Lowdown, both volumes of that, you present things so clearly. This is not a slim tome either. This is full of great exercises. That's great. And so I've got it on my music stand, and I'm going through every maybe once or twice a week and just exploring. And I really think it's so bravo to you. And volume 1, obviously, there's more to come. So do you have any thoughts you want to share about what the next volume might be?
Yeah. So I'm taking an independent study right now with a jazz theorist, and I'm really interested in more of the intervallic possibilities. So one of the ideas on the chopping block right now is to create a book on intervals and voice leading, like seconds and thirds, and some kind of wacky combinations that are not so idiomatic or familiar on the bass. That's one of the ideas. Two other ideas that I would need to spend more time pontificating on. One is a book on sound, which is, at least in my research, I haven't found many resources that just kind of address sound in a jazz the jazz genre. If anybody is listening to this and has suggestions for me to check out, like, I'm totally open to it. But yeah, a book on sound, like creating an idiomatic sound that is sort of in depth. I'm not really sure how I would go about that yet. And then lastly, this is a bit of a bigger thing to chew off, or to bite off and chew. I want to write a book on pedagogy, just sort of taking a thorough survey of jazz-based pedagogy and teaching practices, and maybe do some interviews with people, and try to create a very thorough resource that people can look to for lesson planning ideas. Maybe jazz-based teaching for the non-bass player, I think, is a huge topic. How many people have to conduct a jazz ensemble but don't know much about jazz? Let's say it's someone who went to a college that doesn't play like a traditional, I say with air quotes, traditional jazz ensemble instrument, and then they get that rogue bass player, like, oh, what do I do with this person? And those are the people that I want to target, that I want to try and help out. So yeah, some lofty goals.
I love all of those. Those are all great. And boy, yeah, it'd be so, I would be so interesting to hear more perspectives on jazz teaching. I think, and jazz bass teaching. I think that would be really, really an interesting topic to explore. All of those sound great. For the non bassist, that's a super valuable thing. The bass is always this mystery zone for other instrumentalists, and in the orchestral world especially, I see that there's this deep discomfort with like what's why this is sounding like that. So
yeah, exactly.
It's exciting, Danny. I love following along with what you're doing, and you're one of my favorite people to talk to, so I'm sure we'll do this again very soon. And so DannyZiemann.com will link up to everything that you're up to, Bass Player's Guide to the Trio, and Walk On over at Discover Double Bass, and The Lowdown, and all your great projects. And I think I saw this online, so are you going to be at International Society of Bassists Convention? Are you doing a session?
Yeah, I'm doing a session, and it's going to be more on just teaching in general, and another survey of jazz bass pedagogy, just to try and give some people different things to think about in our profession as we move on towards standardizing some of our practices. And I don't want to give too much away yet.
That's okay. Yeah, people should definitely check that out. I saw Danny do a presentation live in Prague at Bass Europe in 2016, and it was awesome. And so it's fun to follow along, and much more to come, I'm sure. So I really appreciate you taking some time.
Yeah, thank you, man. It's always, like I said, it's always great to be on the show. I'm lucky to be a frequent flyer, and thank you. I mean, thank you for always keeping track and inspiring so many bass players around the world.
Danny, you rock. Thank you so much for chatting again, and we'll have Danny back on the podcast soon for sure. If you're going to be at the ISB convention this summer, like Danny was talking about, he's going to be doing a session there. Definitely check him out. He's a great presenter, and certainly his courses at Discover Double Bass are fantastic. And just learn more about him. Follow him on social. He's a great guy, really active, and always up to something new and creative. DannyZiemann.com, like we said earlier. Contrabass Conversations. Oh, by the way, you can get in touch with me. If you ever want to suggest a guest or just say hi, feedback at contrabassconversations.com puts you in touch. I'd love to hear from you and your thoughts and a little bit about you. That would be great. Okay, now we'll close. Contrabass Conversations is produced by Michael Cooper, Steve Hinchy, Trevor Jones, and Mitch Mooring. And Mitch, by the way, we've had on the podcast in passing during a luthier talk back in 2018, in the summer of 2018. We're going to have Mitch on the podcast with Ralph Alcala, another recent guest, and some other young luthiers, people that are making their full-time living building basses. That's going to be a very cool chat at ISB 2019. Definitely come say hi if you're at the convention, and I know you'll enjoy that episode. So anyway, thank you to Mitch for putting all these episodes together. Learn more about him at mitchmooring.com. And thank you so much to Krista Copper for going through and cataloging and organizing all the topics we talk about in these episodes. Super appreciated. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.